They didn't kill Jesus because he claimed to be the Messiah. Dozens of men had made that claim before him. They didn't kill him because he performed miracles. They celebrated him for that. They killed Jesus because of something far more dangerous, something that threatened to collapse their entire system of power, wealth, and control. The religious leaders had built an empire on the backs of the people, and Jesus was tearing it down brick by brick. Power, control, fear. What I'm about to show you is the full story, not the sanitized version you heard in Sunday school. The real reasons, the political plots, the betrayals that went deeper than 30 pieces of silver. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Jesus had to die, not just spiritually, but why the powers of this world could not allow him to live another day. The threat begins. It started with a whisper. Then it became a roar. When Jesus began his ministry, he wasn't just preaching in the countryside. He was systematically dismantling the religious establishment's grip on the people. The Pharisees had turned faith into a business. They added hundreds of rules to God's law, rules that required people to pay, to sacrifice, to depend completely on the temple system. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. But then Jesus came along saying things like, "Your sins are forgiven," not through the temple, not through a priest, directly from God. Do you understand what that meant? It meant the entire religious economy was suddenly unnecessary. The power structure was cracking. The Pharisees and Sadducees weren't just protecting theology. They were protecting their income, their influence, their very way of life. And Jesus, he was becoming too popular to ignore. But what comes next is where the real conspiracy begins. Political chess. Here's what most people miss. Jesus wasn't just a religious threat. He was a political nightmare. Israel in the first century existed under Roman occupation. The Jewish leaders had a delicate arrangement with Rome. We keep the peace, you let us keep our power. It was a chess game, and everyone was watching their moves carefully. Then Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. The crowds are shouting Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. King, they were calling him king, in a city occupied by Rome, where Caesar was the only king allowed. The religious leaders weren't just angry, they were terrified. If this crowds around Jesus got out of control, Rome would respond with violence, and they would lose everything. Caesar-Rome power. If this teaching is opening your eyes to what really happened, hit like and subscribe for more biblical truth that goes deeper, because what comes next reveals the real mastermind behind it all. The high priest had already made his calculation. One man must die for the nation. Politics disguised as prophecy. Temple cleansing. Then Jesus did the unthinkable. He walked into the temple courts. He saw the money changers, the merchants selling doves at inflated prices, the entire system designed to profit from people's desire to worship God. And he made a whip. Let that sink in. The Prince of Peace made a weapon. Tables flew, coins scattered, animals ran free. He overturned their tables and drove them out shouting, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." This wasn't gentle Jesus, meek and mild. This was righteous fury incarnate. He had attacked their revenue stream. The temple tax alone generated enormous wealth for the religious elite, and Jesus had just declared war on it. Some sins require holy violence to expose. From that moment, the decision was made. He had to be eliminated, not in secret, not quietly, publicly, as a warning to anyone else who might challenge their authority. But they needed a plan that wouldn't cause riots. The insider. Every conspiracy needs an insider. Enter Judas Iscariot. We often paint Judas as simply greedy, 30 pieces of silver for betraying his master, but the story is far darker than mere greed. Judas had walked with Jesus for 3 years. He had seen the miracles, heard the teachings, witnessed the dead raised to life, and yet something in his heart had turned. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. This wasn't just human betrayal. This was spiritual warfare at its most intense. The enemy of your soul found one crack in the armor of Jesus' inner circle, One man whose heart was never fully surrendered. Greed, pride, darkness. The religious leaders couldn't arrest Jesus in public. The crowds loved him too much. They needed someone who knew his patterns, his movements, his quiet places. Judas provided all of it for the price of a slave. But here's the haunting truth. Jesus knew. He knew at the Last Supper exactly who would betray him, and he washed Judas's feet anyway. Midnight arrest. They came at night. Cowards always do. While the city slept, a mob with torches and weapons descended on the Garden of Gethsemane. Soldiers, temple guards, religious officials, all for one unarmed man who had just been praying so intensely that his sweat became like drops of blood. Surrounded, Judas walked up and kissed him, the signal. The ultimate perversion of intimacy turned into betrayal, and then something remarkable happened. Jesus stepped forward and asked, "Who are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And when he said, "I am he," the entire mob fell backward to the ground. The power of his words knocked them down. Even in his arrest, he demonstrated his authority. He could have called legions of angels. He could have walked through them as he had done before. Instead, he surrendered. Not because they overpowered him, because this was always the plan. "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." They thought they were capturing him. They were fulfilling prophecy. Rigged trial. What happened next was a mockery of justice. They dragged Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, in the middle of the night, which was illegal. They brought false witnesses who couldn't get their stories straight, also illegal. They were desperate to find something, anything, to justify what they had already decided to do. 1. Trials at night were forbidden. 2. Multiple witnesses couldn't agree. 3. The verdict was predetermined. 4. They sought to kill, not seek truth. Finally, the high priest asked the question directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered with 2 words that sealed his fate, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his robes and cried blasphemy. They spit on him. They blindfolded him and struck him. They had their excuse, but they couldn't execute him themselves. For that, they needed Rome. Pilate's hands. Pontius Pilate wanted nothing to do with this. He could see it was a setup, a religious dispute that had nothing to do with Roman law. He examined Jesus and found no fault in him. 3 times he tried to release him. Innocent, political, trapped. But the religious leaders had their final weapon. They shouted, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." This was blackmail. Pilate's position was already unstable. Reports of unrest in his province could end his career or his life. Sometimes cowardice wears the robes of compromise. So he called for a basin of water. And in one of history's most symbolic acts, he washed his hands, as if water could remove the stain of condemning an innocent man. The crowd, manipulated by the priests, screamed for Barabbas, a murderer, a rebel, release the guilty, crucify the innocent. And Pilate handed Jesus over to be flogged, the most brutal torture Rome had invented. But even that wasn't enough for his enemies. The cross. After the flogging that nearly killed him, they forced a crown of thorns onto his head, mockery upon agony. They made him carry his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem, the same streets where crowds had hailed him as king days before. Now those streets were lined with silence, or worse, jeers. Golgotha. At the place called the Skull, they drove nails through his hands and feet. They lifted him up between 2 criminals, and for 6 hours, the Son of God hung suspended between heaven and earth. The sky turned dark, the earth shook, creation itself was screaming. But here's what his executioners didn't understand. This wasn't defeat. This was the greatest victory in cosmic history. It is finished. That word in Greek is tetelestai. It was written on receipts when a debt was paid in full. Jesus wasn't saying his life was ending. He was declaring that the debt of humanity's sin was completely, eternally paid. The very death they engineered became the salvation of the world. Conspiracy failed. They thought it was over. They rolled a stone in front of the tomb. They posted Roman guards. They sealed it with the governor's seal, every precaution to make sure this troublemaker stayed dead, sealed, guarded, secure. But on the third day, something happened that shattered their entire conspiracy. The stone rolled, not by human hands. The guards collapsed in terror. The tomb was empty, and Jesus appeared to his disciples, alive. The same hands that were pierced now extended in peace. The same voice that cried out from the cross now spoke comfort. Death could not hold him because he was holding death. The religious leader's response: bribe the guards, tell everyone the disciples stole the body, create a cover story. But lies cannot contain resurrection power. Within weeks, those same disciples were preaching boldly in Jerusalem. The movement they tried to crush began spreading like wildfire. The conspiracy that killed Jesus ended up proving exactly who he was. Why IT matters. So why does any of this matter to you today? Because the same forces that killed Jesus are still at work. Religious systems that prioritize power over people, political convenience over truth, the crowd choosing comfort over conviction. The cross exposes what we value most, but the resurrection declares something even more powerful: that no conspiracy of hell can stop God's plan, that death is not the final word, that the innocent one who was condemned can now declare you not guilty. The very reason they killed him, his claim to be God in the flesh, turned out to be true, and that changes everything. 1. He died for sins he didn't commit. 2. He rose to give life he alone could offer. 3. He invites you into a story still being written. The religious leaders wanted him silenced. 2,000 years later, his name is spoken more than any other in human history. Victory. They meant it for evil. God meant it for your salvation. And now, the question is not what they did to him. The question is, what will you do with him? They killed Jesus because he threatened their power, because he exposed their corruption, because he offered people direct access to God without their permission, and because he claimed to be exactly who he was, the Son of God. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. The conspiracy failed. The tomb is still empty, and the invitation still stands. If you made it this far, comment Tetelestai to declare that you understand what Jesus finished on that cross, paid in full. Stay in the Word, stay in the Spirit, and watch what God does. If this opened your eyes to the full story, subscribe for more biblical truth. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next one.